Chapter 3. The Seminary at Chieri. The young man who, on the 30th of October 1835, pushed open the heavy door of the seminary at Chieri and made his way into the shady quadrangle, outwardly it seemed calm enough, but he had much to occupy his thoughts. His new shovel hat was perched, perhaps a trifle uneasily, on his head. The cassock, to one accustomed to a certain activity, was apt at times to impede his movements. His baggage, for all that it was scanty, was beginning to weigh heavy in his hand. He had walked from Castelnuovo, leaving early in the morning, and having greeted his friends in the town, now came to the seminary, to which, for years, all his thoughts had been directed. It was for this that he had endured and struggled and worked. Outwardly he was calm. Inwardly he savoured to the full what was a solemn moment in his life. Just short of a week before, on the 24th of October, the feast of St. Raphael, the parish priest at Castelnuovo had clothed Don Bosco in the cassock with the words, Induat te Domine novum hominem, qui secundum Deum creatus est in justitia et sanctitate veritatis. That too was a solemn moment, and John prepared for it carefully, and afterwards resolved, as he says, to reform his whole life. Conjuring, acrobatics, and card-playing, and outdoor sports were to go. He would practice temperance in eating and drinking. The youth who at school can scarcely have had enough to eat, he would give up playing on the violin. He would read religious rather than profane authors. He would fight with all his strength against everything contrary to the virtue of chastity. He would make a daily meditation and daily read from some spiritual book. Ordinarily enough, resolutions for a young man on entering the seminary, save perhaps for the acrobatics, card-playing and outdoor sports, and yet it was these things precisely which cost John Bosco more dearly than the others. He did not abandon them without a struggle, nor without a failure or two. He resolved to give them up, he says, because he found them unfitting in a priest. Nevertheless, he was firmly resolved never to adopt that distant attitude which he deplored in very many of the clergy of his day. Such thoughts as these may be read between the lines of John Bosco's own account of this period of his life. His gratitude to those who had helped him along the way appears clearly. Countless benefactors had combined in one way or another to assist him to his goal. Don Cafasso, his masters at school, his mother especially, his neighbours who had bestowed upon him sacks of corn, the cheeses, and other produce to help him pay his way. More lately still, the whole hamlet had clubbed together to fit him out for the seminary. Don Guala of Turin made himself responsible for the first year's fees. What did he look like? In later years, photographs showed John Bosco in his prime and as an old man. At 20 he was solidly built, but with that squareness of body frequently to be encountered in countrymen, of medium height, with thick, curly, dark chestnut hair surrounding his broad forehead, and round, somewhat full face, with eyes whose twinkle lightened the solemn set of his countenance in repose. In company, a smile lit up his face, as if laughter came easily to him. He was endowed with a pleasant tenor voice and a calm manner of speech, which, in combination, rendered him exceedingly attractive. In appearance, then, he looked like the peasant that he was, exhibiting those physical qualities of latent strength and endurance which, backed with great determination and an ability to turn his hand to anything, together with an extraordinary nimbleness of mind and finger, stamped him as one well equipped for the years to come, perhaps as parish priest in some mountain parish, caring for his flock far beyond the strict limits of his duty as an ecclesiastic, sacrificing his strength and wearing himself out in the spiritual and material interests of his parishioners. That first evening in the seminary, having made his bed in the dormitory and called on the superiors, he explored the building with his friend Garigliano, who had been with him in the school at Chieri. The dormitories, the classrooms, the small chapel, the dining hall, the professors' rooms, in spite of their large windows and pleasing proportions, all breathe an atmosphere of gloom. With relief you step into the seminary from the glare of the street to the cool of the building, only to desire to be out again and away from the sombre rooms and depressing corridors. It was well built, airy and with noble proportions, so that it is hard to account for the gloom which broods over the place. Outside, the spacious quadrangle produces an entirely different impression. With all its lines of well-proportioned windows, the vine on the southern wall, the patches of sunlight and shade showing up the red sandstone, it gives no reason to suspect the forbidding aspect within. In John Bosco's day, the seminary was staffed by secular priests, but it had been founded by the Oratorians. And though the building has none of the joy associated with St. Philip Neri and his sons, the church next door, St. Philip's, produces an entirely different impression. A passage leads from it to the seminary, and as you step into the church, it is as if a great load were lifted from your shoulders. John Bosco perhaps felt something of all this as, on the first evening that he came into the quadrangle from within the seminary, looking at the inscription on the stone above the sundial, Afflictis lente, celeres gaudentibus hore. For the sad, at heart, time lags. For the glad, it flies. There's our programme, he remarked. If we're always in good spirits, the time will pass quickly enough. The 6 years of his course passed quickly enough for John Bosco. The succession of daily duties, prayer, lectures, meals, studies, left little time for brooding. As always, he studied hard, and his prodigious memory was of great assistance to him. He prayed hard too. One of the rules of the seminary that he did not keep was that regarding communion. It was laid down that the seminarians were to communicate only on Sundays and the principal feast days. This deprivation of the Eucharist John Bosco felt keenly, but he soon discovered that by missing breakfast he could slip through the passage to the adjoining church, and there, with the connivance of the sacristan, he was able to receive communion. He rejoined his companions at the beginning of the first lecture. John Bosco was probably not alone in acting thus, and it seems hard to suppose that the superiors of the seminary were unaware of what was going on. By shutting their eyes to it, they condoned the practice. As a seminarist, John Bosco deplored the distant attitude of those in authority. They carried out their duties conscientiously enough, but never had anything else to do with their students. It was part of the system those days, and John Bosco had to suffer it with the rest. But it caused him to resolve to effect great changes if ever he were concerned with education. On the other hand, among his fellow students, he had 3 friends: William Garigliano, John Giaconelli d'Avigliana, and lastly, Luigi Comollo. His friendship with the last named went back to his school days. Luigi Comollo joined the school in 1833. He was a gentle, virtuous youth, and the very opposite of his friend Don Bosco, who stood up for him when he was ill-treated by the bullies of the class. On one occasion, Don Bosco used his fists to some purpose on Comollo's assailants. His friend, although grateful for the assistance, was alarmed at his strength. He succeeded in imbuing Don Bosco with more self-control, and by thus setting a rein on his impetuosity, helped him to overcome one of his failings. Don Bosco was certainly much influenced by Comollo. He tried to copy his friend's gentleness and contemplative habit of mind, and though they made as strongly a contrasting pair of friends as can be imagined, Bosco's energetic and full of activity, strong and impetuous, Comollo shy, retiring and frail, there is no doubt that this friendship was one of the major influences in Don Bosco's life. Reading of the account that he wrote of his friend's life seems to disclose, it must be admitted, a youth of impossible virtue, one of those who are almost too good to be true. We cannot avoid these impressions. They may perhaps be the result of the school of hagiography in vogue in the 19th century, and Don Bosco, writing for his contemporary, depicted his friend within the framework of the conventional pattern. So Aloysius, whose mother was from Chieri and whose name Comollo bore, suffered the same fate. His biographers, in fact, may well have set the fashion. Nevertheless, he was a saint, and inspiration and help to many in their struggles. Such considerations, at all events, are of little concern in Comollo's case. What is important is that he was Don Bosco's friend, and was admired by him, and was the one means by which he became what he was. At the beginning of his second year, therefore, Don Bosco was certainly glad to welcome Comollo to the seminary. No doubt he was pleased once more to have his example before him, and to be spurred on by his friend's example of obedience, application, and the rest. But surely he was glad principally because Luigi Comollo was his friend, with whom he could exchange ideas, someone to encourage him, to help and sustain him in hours of trial, someone to hear the plans and cherished hopes that were continually racing through his mind, and someone too to be helped by him, to profit by his quick intelligence, to benefit by his gaiety, someone on a last analysis to share the somewhat constricting life in that austere establishment and instill into it the warmth of human kindness and human friendship. Without him, Don Bosco adds, I might easily have been led away by some of my companions, and should I have made little progress with my vocation. There were some in the seminary whose influence was evil, and we read in Don Bosco's account of those days of conversations that he had, and of obscene books discovered in the desks of some of the students, which showed that they had no right to be where they were. Some who were thus discovered were turned away, and others left of their own accord. But while in the seminary, they were certainly a danger to their companions. Nor did Don Bosco find it easy to forego some of the recreations allowed, which, though innocent enough, for personal reasons he found unsuitable. Permission was given sometimes for a game of cards. Bosco, before he gave it up entirely, was almost always the winner, and the sight of his disappointed comrades' faces made their money weigh heavily in his pocket. Besides, he found that the cards invaded his thoughts to such an extent, he tells us, that I could neither pray nor study for thinking of the King of Hearts or the Knave of Spades. So he gave up playing cards definitively in 1836, at the end of his second year of philosophy. Holidays, too, he found difficult. They were long, from the feast of St John the Baptist, the 24th of June, until All Saints, the 1st of November. Though he made much of the time reading, writing, revising, or continuing his studies, part of it was devoted to manual labour. He worked in the fields at harvest time, helping his brother. He did carpentry and metal work. In 1872, he tells us, he still possessed a desk, table, and chairs that he made with his own hands some 40 years previously. He helped the children on Sundays, and with the encouragement of the parish priest, began to try his hand at preaching. He tells us how once he set out to shoot a hare. Over the fields and vineyards he pursued it, and at last had it within range. He hit it with his first shot. His companions, hearing the shot, came up and admired his bag, but John Bosco was not a little embarrassed. He suddenly realized how he was dressed. He was in shirt sleeves, with no cassock, and an old straw hat on his head. Once, in the holidays, he obtained the post of tutor in Greek to some pupils of the Turin Jesuits. It served to show him that his lot was to be cast with children from humbler homes. Best of all were the holidays when Luigi Comollo was with him, and when he was not there was a frequent interchange of letters. John helped him with his studies and listened to the sermons he had prepared. On one occasion they were alone in the house. The rest of the family were in the fields, and time passed quickly with 101 things they had to talk about. As dinner time drew on, John realized that he must prepare it. "I'll look after the fire," said Comollo. "You can see to the cooking." "First," replied John Bosco, "we must kill a chicken." "No sooner said than done," he writes, "and we caught our bird. It only remained to kill it. Neither of us would undertake it. In the end, we decided that Comollo should hold it with its neck on a log, and I would dispatch it with a hatchet blow. I brought down the hatchet, and the head was separated from the body. I don't know what fear overcame us, but at once we ran out crying. In a few minutes they recovered their wits, returned to the house, plucked and cooked the bird, and enjoyed their meal." Such thrilling incidents hardly seem worth the trouble of recording, but they have their place in the lives of the saints as in other biographies. Friendship, to some extent, is based on experiences shared, and the picture of the two youths in their cassocks setting about the killing and cooking of a chicken possesses a certain charm and reveals a homely and human side to them which, from their earnestness on other occasions, might well be unsuspected. It was not every holiday during the seminary course that John Bosco enjoyed the companionship of Luigi Comollo. In October 1838, it seems, from a remark that he let drop to John Bosco, he had some presentiment of his death, and in 1839, on the 25th of March, he fell ill. A fever, wrongly diagnosed by the doctors, quickly gained the upper hand, and Comollo was soon at death's door. His body racked, his mind disturbed by thoughts of impending judgment, he quickly became delirious. John watched by his bedside. The end soon came. Having regained lucidity, and with it his peace of mind, he received the last sacraments, and his hand on his friends breathed his last at dawn on the 2nd of April, which was Easter Tuesday. He was buried the next day. The following night, an incident occurred in the seminary which bears all the marks of the dramatic and also of the preternatural. It is best described in the words of the principal witness, John Bosco, who has left us a detailed account of what happened. I have told you already, he writes, that between Comollo and me existed sincere friendship and unbounded confidence. Frequently we spoke of what would happen if death were to separate us. One day we had just read a fairly long chapter from the lives of the saints when the conversation turned to death. Without paying much attention to what we said, we came to the conclusion that it would be a very great consolation if the first to quit this earth should come back to reassure the other regarding the salvation of his soul. We returned to the subject on several occasions, and one day we made this pact between us. The first of us to die would, if God allowed it, inform the other of his eternal salvation. I did not realize the grave nature of such a promise, and I must confess that, to say the least, it was imprudent. In any case, I should advise no one to act thus. Nevertheless, the promise was made and even repeated on several occasions during Comollo's final illness. His last words and his last look convinced me that he would keep his promise. Moreover, many of my companions were aware of our pact. The memory of the promise kept him in a state of agitation. He hoped, too, that its fulfillment would offer him some comfort in his loss. He goes on, "It might have been about 11:30, that is, on the night of April the 3rd, when our dormitory, which held about 20 seminarians, was suddenly startled by a fearful noise, which seemed to draw nearer down the corridor. It sounded like a heavy wagon drawn by a powerful team towards the door of the dormitory. Every instant the noise grew louder, making the whole room shake as if by a thunderclap. Frightened out of their wits, the seminarians jumped out of bed and crouched together in a corner, doing their best to reassure each other. At that moment, a thunderclap, more fearful than before, and Comollo's voice was heard distinctly crying, 'Bosco, I am saved.' All heard the noises, several of Comollo's words without understanding their meaning. John Bosco understood them. He adds, 'Then, I admit, for the first time, I was really frightened.' More than one explanation of this phenomenon will probably occur to most readers. I have purposely given it in John's own words, because, although it is interesting and in some cases rewarding to examine these matters in detail, this is no place for it. What we are here concerned with is the life story of him who was principal in the scene just described. But something of that sort happened, there are other witnesses, and that Don Bosco underwent an experience such as he described. Of that there can be no doubt. Other considerations are beside the point in a book of this nature. When Luigi Comollo died, John Bosco was not far off 24 hours in coming to the end of his 4th year at the seminary. Every year the fees at the seminary had to be found. Don Guala, as we have seen, paid the 1st year. John Bosco for the remaining 5 years, by winning in each of them an exhibition amounting to 60 francs, awarded to the seminarist whose conduct and work showed the most promise, and by receiving his 2nd year of theology the appointment of sacristan, which carried with it a further 60 francs, was able to produce about half the fees. The balance was provided by Don Cafasso. Don Cafasso's memory was still green at the seminary. He was ordained and left there just 2 years before John Bosco's entry, where he had been the best student of his year. More than anything else, writes Bosco, What bound me most strongly to these walls was the name of Don Cafasso. The odour of his virtue still lingered there. His charity to his companions, his submissiveness to his superiors, his patience in bearing with his neighbours' defects, his care to give no offence to anyone, his pleasure in helping everyone, his indifference to his diet, his resignation to violent changes of weather, his readiness to take the catechism for little children, his bearing, which was always edifying, his zeal in study and piety, all these virtues left their fragrance behind them at the seminary. In reading these lines, one can discern between them indications of the hardships of the life in that somewhat forbidding and austere place. John Bosco followed closely in Don Cafasso's footsteps. On Thursdays, his free day, he found work ready to hand with the boys and the youths who came to him at the seminary. He helped them with their lessons and religious instruction. He tells us too of his reading in addition to the prescribed books of his theological course. Calmet's commentary on the books of the Old and New Testament, the Jewish Antiquities of Josephus, the Latin edition, and the same author's Palestinian War, another 2-folio volumes, Bishop Freinos's Défense du Christianisme, Fleury's Histoire ecclésiastique, Henrion's works appeared in Italian, Segneri's sermons, and the works of Balmes. Of his other personal studies at this time, John Bosco speaks of his preference for Greek. He was helped in this by a Jesuit, Father Bini, who for 4 years corrected a weekly exercise which he sent him. Thus I came to read Greek as easily as Latin. At this time, too, he began French and mastered the rudiments of Hebrew. That not unimpressive reading list by which John Bosco supplemented the lectures at the seminary is testimony, among other things, of his excellent memory. He still needed but to hear the lecture or read the set portion of the textbook to have mastered it completely. And it is evidence, too, of an inquiring mind which will not be satisfied with manuals and digests. If he could not go to the sources, he went to the best standard works at his disposition. By this time, John Bosco's character should have appeared sufficiently for it to be clear that, good student and devout as he most certainly was, he had nothing of that forbidding and unattractive inhumanity which not infrequently appears in those who are held up as model seminarists. It was impossible not to love John Bosco. At the seminary at Chieri, in spite of the fact that he would not play cards with them or do his conjuring tricks to enliven a free Sunday afternoon, it appears clearly that they all loved him. My superiors were fond of me, he says, and surrounded me with attention. My fellow seminarists bore me the most sincere affection. He was popular, and everyone knew that he would help, and that his help was given ungrudgingly, and that, like all that he did, it was efficient. A man was in difficulties over some theological point incompletely understood, Bosco would put it straight for him. Another needed a hole mended in his cassock, a battered beretta made to serve. Don Bosco would help. Was there a tonsure to be shaved afresh? Bosco's razor was sharp, and he would wield it willingly and expeditiously. He summed it up in 4 words: I was everyone's friend. So as the end of his course drew near, he shortened it by reading a year's work in 1 summer holidays, despite the fact that the goal, the fruit of his struggles and privations was now in sight, he found the prospect of leaving the seminary cause for sadness. It was only momentary, however, and any lingering doubts he might have had about being ready for his life's work, and he appears to have had none, would have been dispelled by a further dream at this time, which indicated to him clearly what his future work would be. As with the first, it urged him to seek among the young the field of his apostolate. It came as a confirmation of his vocation. On the 19th of September 1840, John Bosco was ordained subdeacon at Turin. The diaconate followed on the Saturday of Passion Week, the 27th of March 1841, and on the 26th of May he went into retreat at the Vincentian house in Turin in preparation for his ordination to the priesthood. The notes of his retreat contained the 9 resolutions which he made at this solemn moment of his life. They can be set down here without commentary, for they speak for themselves, and their punctual execution for the rest of his days is added testimony to his disinterested determination in taking them. 1. I will take no unnecessary walks. 2. I will make exactingly careful use of my time. 3. When the salvation of souls is at stake, I will be always ready to suffer, to act, and to humble myself. 4. May the charity and gentleness of St. Francis de Sales inform my every action. 5. I will be content with the food set before me, unless it is really harmful to my health. 6. I will always add water to my wine, and drink it only for reasons of health, that is, on such days and in such measure as health requires. 7. Since work is a powerful weapon against the enemies of my salvation, I will take only 5 hours sleep a night. During the day, especially after dinner, I will take no rest, except in case of illness. 8. Every day I will devote some time to meditation and spiritual reading. During the day I will make a short visit, or at any rate a prayer, to the Blessed Sacrament. My preparation for Mass will last at least a quarter of an hour, and so shall my thanksgiving. 9. Outside the confessional, and save in cases of strict necessity, I will never stop to talk with women. John Bosco was ordained priest by the Archbishop of Turin, Monsignor Franzoni, in his private chapel on the Ember Saturday in Whit Week, the 5th of June, 1841. And he said his first Mass next day, Trinity Sunday, in the Church of St. Francis of Assisi at the altar of the guardian angels, assisted by his friend and counselor, Don Cafasso, professor of moral theology at the Convito Ecclesiastico adjoining the church. It was the most wonderful day of my life, wrote John Bosco some years later. He tells us how he prayed at this Mass for all those who had helped him. I recommended to God all my professors, my spiritual and temporal benefactors, especially my late lamented Don Cafasso, whom I ever hold as the dearest among them. Next day he said Mass at the Church of the Consolata, a shrine of Our Lady in Turin, to thank the Blessed Virgin for the innumerable favours she had obtained for me from her Son. He then set out for Chieri, where he spent 2 days, and said Mass at St. Dominic's and at the cathedral. For Corpus Christi he was at Castel Nuovo, where he sang the parish Mass and carried the monstrance in the procession. The parish priest gave a dinner in honour of the new priest. Friends and relations and neighbouring clergy were invited. Afterwards, Margaret Bosco and her son walked back to Becky, where they spent the night. Of all that they had to say to each other, going over the memories of the past and their combined struggle to attain what now had come to pass, planning for the future, the fulfillment of John's dreams, the first of which he had experienced there in childhood. We know nothing, save one remark of Margaret Bosco's, which John was fond of repeating to close friends in after years. "So now you are a priest, John, my son," she told him. "You will say Mass every day. You must remember this. Beginning to say Mass means beginning to suffer. At first you won't notice it, but in time, one day, you will see that your mother is right. I am sure that every morning you will pray for me. I will ask for no more than that. Henceforward, think of nothing but the saving of souls, and don't worry about me."